Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. The modern attack surface is vast and permeable, extending from the data center to the cloud and device edge. Security teams are stretched thinner and thinner as they try to cover this ground. The result? More high-profile breaches hit the news every day. Don't let your organization be next. ExtraHop delivers security from the inside out, helping enterprise security teams detect threats up to 95% faster and cut staff time to resolve by 2/3 or more. Act with confidence. Learn more at extrahop.com/securityweekly. Major data security breaches continue to make headlines. Are you prepared? Standardizing your security framework will help you stay competitive, be a reliable business partner, and manage intellectual property, financials, and employee and customer information. The American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, offers the standards you need in one place through standard subscriptions, a cost-saving, fully customizable solution. Sign up for your free trial at securityweekly.com/ANSI.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by my co-host this week, Lee Neely. Lee, thank you for stepping in this week.
Always happy to help. It's a pleasure to come and play with you guys and learn some cool stuff. I'm looking forward to a neat interview.
Yes, me too. Security Weekly will be at Hacker Halted in Atlanta, Georgia this October 10th through 11th. EC Council is offering our listeners a 15% discount to sign up for any of their bootcamp courses or workshops. Visit securityweekly.com/Hacker Halted to register now. Also, register for our upcoming webcast with LogRhythm, Domain Tools, and SaltStack by going to securityweekly.com/webcast. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find them in our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right, let's get to our interview. Andrew Hollister is Chief Architect and Product Manager of LogRhythm Labs at LogRhythm. With over 20 years of experience, he has worked both in the private and public sectors, and he has held a variety of security roles, including those focused on SIEM, DLP, and application-level firewall design and implementation. Driven by his passion for machine analytics, Andrew initially joined the LogRhythm team in 2012 to help mature the AI engine. He now works closely with LogRhythm's executive leadership and product management teams to steer broader product strategy. Andrew, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thanks, Paul. It's nice to be on with you guys.
Yeah, so we're going to talk security operations, maturity model, and some metrics around how to measure the effectiveness of your SOC. And a lot of this is based on a white paper that LogRhythm put together. But I always love to talk about measurement and metrics and maturity because they're things that I think a lot of organizations struggle with in trying to really understand, where am I in my maturity? How do I measure effectiveness? What are some of those metrics I need to report up to the board? And this is a really interesting slice when we look at it from a pure security operational standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really where we came at this from is it's really business 101. You can't improve what you don't measure. And ultimately there's some evidence that just by measuring things also improve. You don't actually have to take any other action than to start measuring something to actually affect some improvements. And we very much came at it from this perspective. Let's start to measure effectiveness. Let's put some kind of more business typical metrics around what we're trying to achieve in the SOC. And then that gives us a basis for improving our effectiveness over time. And also, hopefully highlights where we need to mature the capability that we've got in our security operations center in order to move the needle on some of those metrics that we're creating.
One of the first metrics I pulled out in this document was time to detect a breach. You know, back when I worked at RSA, and even in my early days at Tenable, I think we were somewhere north of probably 200 days to detect a breach
That's
on our
right.
network. Now we're at about 101 days. So right away, I'm like, wait, we've at least improved our detection times. I mean, 101 days is still a little long, but it's better than what it was, which was, kind of over 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really encouraging to see. Verizon, amongst others, have been tracking this kind of data for, I think last year was their 10-year anniversary report. And it is encouraging to see that overall, at a very high level, we're tracking down compared to where we were, 3 years, 5 years and more ago. And as you rightly say, we were looking at 250 days or something of that order. And that was the median, meaning that a lot of breaches took much longer than that to discover. And perhaps they were never actually being discovered at all. So I think it's a testament to some of the work that's been done, and not least the kind of visibility around breaches and that it's become much more of a business problem rather than it being the IT department's responsible for this. It's actually become a board level issue, so it's got that kind of focus. But if we take the 101 days that was reported this year by Mandiant as being the median they found in their data set, we're still talking about more than 3 months to detect the average attacker. And their data also went on to say that the vast majority of attacks take more than 2 weeks to discover. And 2 weeks is a very long time for an attacker to be loose in your network, exploring, moving around, and really trying to attain their ultimate goal. And I guess this is really coming to the conversation around dwell time and how much time does the attacker really have to achieve what they're after. And if you think, if I send a spear phishing email, I've done my research, I've identified who I want to send the email to, and how I'm going to go about doing that. It's perhaps seconds from the moment I send that email to the moment the CEO clicks on it. And they're in. If the dwell time is then 2 weeks, that they've got a lot of space to achieve their ends before somebody's likely to start picking up on them.
Yeah, I think Lee
Has there been?
resembles that remark, that comment.
Yeah. So is there any information on where there's a sweet spot on detection where if you can get below this measurement, you're going to get the highest return, or shall I say it the other way? Is there a point where pretty much you're owned if it's been this long, or is that still too soft to pull out?
Yeah, there's some interesting reports been done over the last few years. And actually, the Aberdeen group did a report where they looked very precisely at the kind of correlation between the real business impact of a breach versus the amount of time it took them to detect it. And they used Verizon's data set amongst other things. And what they found was if you could detect within 30 days, you could achieve a 25% reduction in business impact. So that was quite a kind of good pivot point. And in fact, there was another report by Poneman that said you could reduce the cost of a breach by in their data set by the cost of it by $1 million if you could detect within 30 days. But the Aberdeen group went on to say if you could detect in 7 days, you could actually reduce the impact by 77%, which is quite phenomenal, really. It's a 3/4 reduction in business impact simply by being able to detect something bad has happened within a 7-day period, which, in IT terms, I guess seems like an eternity. But compared to our 101 days or even 30 days, that seems like a really significant impact to be able to make. And just to complete the set, if you could get that down to 1 day, then they found a 96% reduction in business impact. For a significant threat actor who's trying to achieve a significant breach, you're more or less eradicating the effect. But the number of companies that are at that stage today is obviously pretty limited.
Yeah, and I think there's also a balance of the cost associated with getting to 30 or 7 days or whatever the number is versus how much risk you're actually reducing. And so I think every business is going to have to kind of make their judgment calls to say, well, is it worth making an investment to get us down to 30 days, 7 days, or even faster to detect based on the cost it's going to cost us to get there? So there's always that balance, I think, both from a budgeting perspective and the risk reduction side.
Yeah, very much so. I agree, and obviously it costs money to invest in these different technologies, and it's not only the technology investment; it's investing in the right people and having the right processes, and I think that's a kind of nice segue into why would we measure? It's kind of, well, how do I know the investment that I'm making's actually working today? And how do I know, is this next investment to take me down to 50 days, 30 days, 10 days, or whatever it is that actually going to provide me a return based on the cost of it, the kind of on costs of it, and the return that I'm likely to get out of defending against that particular kind of breach?
Yeah. So where do we start first in when we think about this? Do we look at the maturity model component first, or do we look at the metrics piece first?
I think we really start off with the metrics, and it really does come back to what I mentioned just a moment ago. How do I actually know my investment is working? And if I can actually start to tease these metrics out of my SOC over a period of time, and I can actually begin to tease it out, for example, to different types of attacks, then I know it takes me 10 days to respond to a ransomware attack. That's something that I really need to provide some focus on. But if I've got a more stealthy attack, perhaps an insider whose behavior is beginning to change, perhaps I know that takes me 30 days to discover. But I think for many organizations, the kind of metrics that they're perhaps looking at is, how many alarms get raised in my environment on a daily basis. It's a number, it's a metric, but it's not really giving them the kind of depth of visibility that will actually help them to understand, the fact that I get 50 alarms, maybe 48 of them are false positives. So just measuring that metric alone is not really giving me a huge amount of visibility into the effectiveness level of my SOC versus a plain number. I got this many. And what we really wanted to do with this model is help organizations get a little bit lower into this and say, okay, I get so and so many alarms, but if 50% of them are false positives and the other 50% take me 10 days to respond to, where's the actual issue here? And the kind of overall time to detect and time to respond give me a very good starting point, and then I want to dig a little bit more deeply into those to find out, let's get me some metrics that actually point me in the right direction where I should be looking now.
Yeah, and you broke these, you identified 7 kind of key metrics in order to kind of measure across this life cycle. And what I thought was interesting is, you really start to think about not the number of alarms, but things like time to triage and time to qualify an alarm versus the actual number of alarms that are happening. Because to your point, if half of them are false positives, but it takes me a long time to triage and qualify them, that's creating a potential dwell time for all those that are active alarms and should be investigated.
Yeah, absolutely, and exactly to that point, if we can drill down a little bit further and say, hey, it takes me a long time to initially qualify an alarm, what's the reason for that? And by teasing out that level of metric, then I can actually begin to get a bit of directionality on this and say, well, perhaps the real reason is I can't get the qualifying information. Maybe I don't have access to the right kind of vulnerability feeds, or I can't get kind of asset data about what's actually existing in my network. And those metrics can help begin to steer me to, where actually I'm not just investing in the latest and greatest technology for the sake of it, but I'm saying, hey, I've got a space here, and the consequence of that space is that my SOC analysts are taking longer to qualify a threat, and they're actually spending, as you said, much too much time on false positives because it's taking them a long time to qualify everything. And if I can actually reduce that part of the kind of threat life cycle, then I've got more time to focus in on those threats that really do represent risk to my environment. And I can focus my kind of analyst cognitive cycles back in those things that they really need those cycles for.
Right, exactly.
So we spend a lot of time in the last few years, a lot of focus, at least in my circles, on making sure we're getting all the data into the SOC, that everything's purporting in, that the data, and we can search it and we can correlate it. So I felt like there was a lot of detection effort spent at potentially the expense of other parts of the equation necessary to investigate, mitigate, or recover. And I was wondering, is there any tall pole or something shining out where we're ignoring now, or we should spend more attention on?
Yeah, and I think to that point, we've spent a lot of time, as you say, on collection and getting everything in, and then perhaps building some alarms around that. And I think the big question is, all right, I've got an alarm that's raised either by some kind of behavioral detection or perhaps by a pattern match or something like that. And typically SOCs report, I get loads of these, I'm overwhelmed, I've got too many. And it seems to me it's this kind of next qualification stage that's really, really key. What can I get the technology to do for me? What can I get my processes to do for me that will actually facilitate my my kind of people resources that I've got, which in most cases are quite limited. SANS did a report, I think, in 2018 that said the average SOC is kind of 2 to 3 people in their survey. And we've got those kind of people limitations. And ultimately, if rather than just providing a person with a single alarm, if I can provide them with an alarm and all the kind of qualifying information that sits around that alarm, so I can go out and query a virus total, I can go and query some sort of domain lookup tool and all those kind of things right up front, so that when the analyst comes to the alert that's been raised, they've actually got the whole picture. And all those cycles of kind of manually going out to websites and looking up IP addresses and checking hashes and all those kind of things. If we can do all of that up front for the analyst, then we actually get over quite a lot of this delay that can often be introduced quite early in the investigation, just because I've got so many of them to look at and many repeatable actions. A machine's very good at going out and doing those kind of repeatable, boring things. Perhaps a human being's not so interested in doing that. And is that really the best use of my limited SOC resources? Probably not. If I can get a machine to do it for me, let me use the technology to go and do that, so that I've got a whole picture in front of me and can quickly, rule out the false positives and focus my kind of cycles on things that really represent risk.
So tools can really augment aspects of these metrics to really kind of bring them down through technology. You still need that human element. So I'm assuming things like investigation and the ability to look at what it's going to take to mitigate and recover still require a good amount of human interaction. And so if I can weed out the triage and some of the qualification steps, now I can focus my resources more on the investigation, what a potential mitigation recovery plan starts to look like. Now, I guess I can also augment pieces of those over time with technology. Obviously, that's part of the promise of SOAR in orchestration automation platforms. But is that where you want to see those metrics in how you want to try to align the measurements and how you leverage technology to bring down some of those to focus on the ones that are a little more important?
Yeah, completely. That's exactly how I look at it. And I think one of the interesting things is, you mentioned SOAR and the kind of automation and orchestration and workflow and so on. And I think very often when both vendors and organizations have those conversations, we very quickly jump to remediation. And that may or may not be appropriate for the organization or for the type of threat that they're facing. But I think a lot of the promise of automation and orchestration is actually in the investigation, in the qualification stage, and actually being by automating all those kinds of steps, we can actually focus the SOC analyst and their limited time on the things that take what we might call human cognitive cycles, I suppose. We've got the machine doing the things that it's good at, perhaps sifting through large amounts of data, repeatedly going out to different sources and correlating them together. And if we can get the machine to do that, if we can get our automation and workflow to take all those steps, then we release all those all that time for the analyst to do what actually ultimately takes human intelligence to look at and assess. Well, actually, this is concerning because this user account's being used, and I happen to know that the individual in question is off on holiday in some place or the other. A machine doesn't necessarily know that unless you're feeding that information to it. And or the person's changed their role, or they're doing a special project and so on and so forth. And being able to bring that kind of the human eye to it at the right time without having to spend all the time on the kind of collection and correlation of data is really one of the key things that we want to get to. And if we can get the measurements that point us, an investment in a bit of automation here will actually free up our analyst to do some more investigation type activity, then we've got a clear return on investment. And we've done this ourselves with we use LogRhythm ourselves, and obviously, like everybody else, we get phishing emails, and we had our SOC analysts were manually investigating phishing emails, and obviously that takes a significant amount of time when you're going out and doing that manually. So our SOC team actually sat down and automated the process of checking out the email subject line and the sender and how many people had received it, and checking out the attachments and all that kind of work. And they actually got their response time for those kind of, or their investigation time for those kind of incidents down to 2 minutes. They can completely triage that in a couple of minutes or so. So being able to leverage the technology in those places where we know we typically burn human cycles really gives us an advantage in being able to leverage the kind of limited resources that we've got.
Yeah. So now that we have these metrics, right, and you've laid out these great 7 metrics to measure the effectiveness of the SOC, how do I now apply these metrics into the maturity model, right? You've built a 4-step maturity model. Most maturity models I'm used to are more of a 5-step, based on the capability maturity model of initial, repeatable, defined, managed, optimized, etc. How do I now, based on these metrics, kind of put myself into one of these maturity buckets? And then what do I do with that to really help me figure out what do I do next?
Yeah, so what we've done with the maturity model is looked at different kinds of organizational characteristics and organizational risks, and looked at the technologies that typically align with those things. And I think the interesting thing with these kind of models, it's very easy to be a bit too prescriptive. So you actually end up making a lot of assumptions about what kinds of technologies people have got in place. And what we've tried to do with this model is, it's really very focused in on this particular problem space of security operations and the core programs and workflow of the SOC. So we've really tried to take it on a basis of, these are the kind of typical organizational risks. These are the typical organizational characteristics that you'd see at these different levels of the security operations maturity model, and then kind of map those out from there, so that we can say, for example, let's say I'm at a level 1. I've kind of begun on the security journey. I've started to implement, perhaps I've got some compliance driven requirements, or something along those kind of lines. And I actually know, if I'm at that level, it still takes me probably weeks typically to detect a more advanced type of attack, but I'm on the journey. I've made a start on it. And then within the model, then we can actually see if we make an investment in, for example, our people, or we start to apply a more structured process to the way that we go about our incidents response, and maybe, for example, we put in place some basic playbooks that can actually have a measurable effect on our time to detect and time to respond, and help us to move forward on this maturity model. And as you indicate, this isn't a kind of one step. I'm going to go from zero to hero in a year. We're really looking at a process over time of addressing those parts of the security operations where we see weaknesses from our measurements. We make our investment there, and then we continue to measure over time, and get that visibility into how we're performing against the model.
Yeah, the way I've seen most of these applied is you look at a set of capabilities and then you kind of measure yourself on this maturity scale. And what you end up is with the spider graph, right? The graph that shows you, well, and these capabilities I'm a 4, and these capabilities I'm a 1. And it kind of helps you identify, oh, I need to make some improvements in those 1 capabilities to start to move them into more mature capabilities. And it looks like a lot of your metrics really start to tie in when you get into maturity levels 3 and 4, where you're doing some of the basic metrics. As you move into 4, more of these advanced metrics, probably along the lines of the 7 that you guys have identified, that as I'm measuring these, that's improving my overall maturity of how my SOC is operating.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. Part of the kind of maturing of your operations is that you begin to build out those metrics, and you build out deeper metrics as you get further up the model. I think it's perhaps stating the obvious, but perhaps often the obvious isn't followed. There's no point in generating metrics and reports if they're going to be kind of buried in a cupboard somewhere. The purpose really is to try and surface these metrics up in a quickly accessible and visible way, so that I begin to get a really a guide. What we're doing really well on ransomware. I talked to an organization recently who said they had a ransomware attack, and they were stood at the desk side of the kind of patient 0 within 35 minutes. They were doing a pretty good job of that by most standards. But maybe in the same organization, it could have been that there were other types of incident where their processes weren't quite as well defined. They perhaps weren't as slick as doing those. And if we can get the metrics down to incident types. So I actually know, yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I've invested what I need to invest in the ransomware space for the moment. Now I've actually moved on, and I'm looking a bit more at my insider threats, or I'm looking at other types of attacks and building out the metrics around those as well.
Yeah, it's almost three-dimensional, I guess, a little bit when you think about metrics associated with attack type, that with a set of capabilities and a maturity, and it's those dimensions that if you're measuring them correctly and you understand your maturity along those different capabilities, that's what's going to give you the roadmap to continue to make the right investments to improve your overall security operations.
That's exactly the case, Paul. And you know, this is a I know it's a little bit of a cliche in our space, but you know, it is a journey. It's not there isn't really an end destination of this as such. And when you get to the kind of top stage of our model, it's very much about continual evaluation and improvement over time as well. And you know, if we can keep focusing on that, and as the attack surface expands and the kind of variety of attacks continues to expand, then you know there'll always be something for us to improve and focus on and understand. You know, perhaps we were doing very well in a particular area, and then the attack vector changed a little. And at that point, then we actually needed to revisit our playbook. We needed to revisit our run book, and very much to this kind of continual improvement cycle.
Yeah. Hey, Lee, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Because I'm taking over the interview. I want to give you a chance.
It's quite all right. It's just great stuff, and both our brains are going crazy. So as I look at the maturity model, I think, gee, it's really tempting to be overly optimistic. So how do you keep people honest on where they are? What's the advice?
I think from our experience in the field, what we've found worked very well was to work with several representatives from the customer, because you know, with something like this, you really get out of it what you put in. So we would typically sit down and do a workshop with our customer and say, hey, let's look at all the different aspects of the threat lifecycle management workflow, the kind of core workflow of the SOC, and just talk through the different elements of that. And you know, if you can get, let's say, your SOC manager and perhaps a CISO and a SOC analyst and perhaps an IT manager in the room together, and actually talk through these different aspects of the threat lifecycle, then you know, you actually get a much more rounded picture than you might by just kind of treating it as a checkbox exercise and kind of sitting down at your desk and saying, yeah, we're pretty good at this and we're not very good at that. If you actually go through the process and give it, you know, the space it needs in terms of time and being able to discuss between the different kind of stakeholders within the business, then you know, not only do you get a better idea of where you are, but what we've seen is those individuals in the room tend to keep each other a little bit honest. And you know, perhaps one individual thinks, you know, we've got full collection across our whole environment, and somebody else in the room might say, well, you know, we acquired this little company last week, we're not actually collecting anything from there yet. And actually, there's a really useful learning exercise within the organization itself that's based off of taking a kind of workshop approach to this and saying, okay, you know, we're starting at zero. Where are we today? What have we got in place? What's working? What's not working? Not just the technology, but also the people and the process that go around it. And then kind of going from there to, well, you know, where do we need to get to? What's a realistic goal for us as an organization over the course of, let's say, the next year or 18 months? And, you know, you're not really going to go from a 0 on the model to a 4 on the model in the space of a year. It's going to take you time and investment. And as you mentioned, Paul, you know, perhaps not everybody wants, needs, or has the budget to get to level 4. But as an organization, you agree what that target is and really what's right for you with your threat and risk profile.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. Lee, any additional questions for Andrew while we have him?
No, that was a really good response. I'm actually pretty much set here. Thank you very much. That was awesome.
Andrew, thank you for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you very much, guys. It's great to talk.
If anyone wants to learn more about LogRhythm or download the SOC Maturity Model white paper, please visit securityweekly.com/LogRhythm. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.